gamers, gals, non-binary pals. It is time for once in our lives to watch a Yu-Gi-Oh player who actually does have tops. That's not named Joshua Schmidt. And that is gonna be Jesse Cotton. He posted a video, what I hate about Yu-Gi-Oh. And as Yu-Gi-Oh's most notorious fucking hater, I have to agree. I do hate Yu-Gi-Oh, but I want to see what his reasons are. I mean, this is a guy who's literally been playing since he was like, before he was even conceived, probably. He was probably thinking of like multi-faker FTK lines in the womb. So let's give it a watch, what I hate about Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yu-Gi-Oh is an incredible game, and I've been playing for almost 20 years at this point. I'm drawn to its balanced complexity and limitless options. And despite the hundreds of little things you can do differently in each game, every small action makes a difference. And oftentimes, skillful choices will prevail. A lack of barriers in deck construction will also let creativity flourish, and innovators are frequently rewarded. All of these things combined are a mere fraction of the elements in Yu-Gi-Oh that I love. But there's one thing in Yu-Gi-Oh that I absolutely detest. In Yu-Gi-Oh, the way you interact with your opponent can be classified into 3 categories. A removal effect that'll kill your opponent's monsters, a negation effect that'll stop your opponent's abilities, or a floodgate effect that'll restrict the actions your opponent is allowed to make.
This is what I'm talking about,
baby! Has been rallying against negates, and with the banning of Baron de Fleur and Borlord Savage Dragon, it seems like we are trending to a future with a lot less of these type of abilities. While an abundance of negates in the game creates an unfun environment, this isn't my biggest problem with the game.
I mean, I'm not saying that he's wrong, but he is 100% right in the sense where Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of trending away from the idea of negates being the primary form of disruption in Yu-Gi-Oh. Like, we can kind of see it in like the current format even, where we had the Fire King Kirin, or we have Flamberge into IP, into SP. Like, the only real negate that exists like right now in terms of a hard negate is maybe like Hope Harbinger that could be made in Snake Eye, and Appaloosa. And there's a very real chance Appaloosa is getting banned. Negates are just a social construct. You're right, just tell your opponent no. All my cards are spell speed 4. Speaking of spell speed 4, have you read Saiyan Summon?
Floodgates, a whole other form of interrupt the community has been crusading against, has a specific subset within the classification that is truly the scourge of this game. Lingering Floodgates, a type of effect that restricts the opponent's actions for a set amount of time. These cards activate their effects and then cannot be interacted with for the duration of the restriction. This means if a Lingering Floodgate is a monster and you'd use its ability, but then is later killed in battle or by card effects, the restriction still applies. It does not go away. It is in place for the entirety of the duration that it lists. And I think that is just ridiculous.
Just play around it. For those of you who aren't ready to build around D-Shifter, you should just be prepared for it. Duelists are showing up with deck lists not prepared to beat my D-Shifter. You should just learn to deck build better. Post the fucking shitty Jesse Cotton Mystic Mind tweet here. I know this is insane for me to say. I don't think they're that bad. Do I think they're very frustrating and very, very stupid to deal with? Absolutely. I think that they're so horseshit. But the only lingering floodgates that have been like historically good are Droll and Lockbird, which almost every time Droll and Lockbird is relevant, people figure out ways to play around Droll and Lockbird anyways, or D-Shifter. And I'm gonna say it, chat. You guys might not like it. Set this on player. I play Tenpai, okay? You guys may not like my opinion about D-Shifter. I think D-Shifter is a healthy card. Feel free to fucking roast me in the comments. I can take it. It is a cross that I have to bear. I think cards like Shifter are just fine. They're completely legal. They're completely fine. They're just so okay. Do you know why? Because I think that Shifter is only playable in dog shit decks. If your deck is able to play Shifter 99% of the time, you're playing a bad deck. D-Shifter is a balanced cards. The decks that can abuse it are the problem. I'll be real. There aren't even that many decks that can abuse it in the first place. Like, are you gonna tell me that like Thunder Dragon is a good deck? Are you guys trying to tell me that like Flu Wanderees is a good deck? These are decks that can abuse Shifter, but these are decks who also have win rates in the single digits. Prime Kashira. Prime Kashira was a very, very specific exception to that rule. Like, Kashira, without a doubt, was one of the silliest fucking decks of all time. But full power Kashira was such a specific anomaly for how pushed that archetype was. Like, let's be fucking real. What the fuck was Konami doing thinking about printing, like, Unicorn Theosis? What were they thinking printing, like, a Rise Heart? These are archetypes that Konami very clearly designed to be able to abuse cards like Shifter and Big Bang and a Rise Heart Banished type effects. Tenpai? Tenpai fucking sucks with Shifter. Don't fucking at me. I'll be real. I'm just saying that for most of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, outside of very specific instances, most lingering floodgates are kind of bad.
So this isn't something that's been away from the public eye. people have talked about these cards quite a bit, and many have been banned, but I still think there are a lot of criminal cards. The game would be a lot better without existing. Some very big common ones you may see in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now are cards like Dimensional Barrier, Dimension Shifter, Joel and Lockbird. How about Hot Red Dragon, Archer Fiend, King Calamity? That one's a tongue twister, but also terrible. Or Gimmick Puppet Nightmare. If you sat across from these cards in the last bit, you've probably been pretty frustrated. And if you're
I'll be real again. This is another fucking hot Stevie take. I think Hot Red doesn't need to be banned. This is what I call the Hot Red Dragon litmus test. Let's say you're a deck whose entire purpose is to consistently and as efficiently as possible make Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. Your entire deck's purpose is a one-card starter that just does the entire combo on its own. Now, would you guys say that that is a good deck or a bad deck? A lot of you guys may initially think, oh my god, it's a turn 1 turn skip, and on the follow-up they could just make any other level 12. In reality, this deck fucking sucks because it loses to hand traps, it loses to board breakers, it loses to spot removal, it loses to super poly, it loses to 5 million fucking cards across the earth. There are so many cards that beat it that the idea of just like, haha, just draw the out is actually fucking real, because there are so many cards that are outs versus this deck that in any given game you're like 70% favored to draw it out for the board. Red Hot wins you one game and then it flops. Exactly. Red Hot is able to like maybe cheese one win, and then every single other game for the rest of that match it's just gonna do fucking nothing, because everyone's gonna know exactly what to side for you, everyone's gonna know exactly what to hit, exactly what to save, that sort of deal. Now again, I don't want to pretend that lingering floodgates as a whole are fine, but I do want to say that the majority of them, like Shifter, Droll, Hot Red, these cards for the most part aren't that bad. But does the card promote good and or fun gameplay? Well, I'll be honest, everyone's idea of fun, good, or healthy gameplay does differ from person to person. Like, I'll be honest with you guys, I'm a fucking psychopath. I enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! The most when other people are struggling for their lives. I want to look them dead in the eye, and my opponent just has this look of fear and regret and acceptance in their eyes. Just this wallowing, longing sadness in their soul that they know that they can literally do nothing to escape what's about to happen to them. This is why I've historically played decks like True Draco, played decks like Labyrinth, played decks like Runic Stun, and most currently, Tenpai. Are these interesting interactive strategies? Fucking no. Let's be honest with ourselves. Do these strategies appeal to a specific type of player? Damn straight.
you're not playing TCG, well, Master Duel has more of them. You could have been Max Seed, you could have been Red Rebooted, you could have been Artifact Scythed. None of these cards are fun to play against, and I don't get it, because in many cases these cards have such very limited counterplay. The ability to interact with them is so little. A card like Dimensional Barrier is so hard for you to play around, because if you go second and your opponent flips it on you, and your deck is Mono Synchro, Mono Exceed, or Mono Fusion, or AS Mono Ritual as well, you have almost nothing you could do. In other Floodgate cases, like a Summon Limit or Anti-Spell Fragrance or Skill Drain, which I'm not really advocating for either here, but I still think they're better than these cards. Barring Anti-Spell Fragrance, you could have back removal like Lightning Storm, like Harpy's Feather Duster, that'll kill the Floodgates, and you'll get past it no problem. Part of the problem in the past was backing those Floodgates up with Negates meant that wasn't a viable strategy, but if Negates aren't going to be in the game as much, then that's not a big of a problem. However, a card that doesn't need to stay on the field means those don't work. And in many cases, the cards that exist in these Floodgate forms don't have a lot of pre-existing ways that you can interact with them. Now, some cards have some interactability, and that is the only merits to a card like Gimmick Puppet Nightmare existing, is that there are so many moving pieces in the Despia combo to resolve Nightmare that maybe it is justifiable and there's enough counterplay against it that it's worth doing. But again, go back to Dimension Barrier or Dimension Shifter. Those come down either in your draw phase on turn 1 or turn 2. The amount of cards that can answer that are close to 0. It's not many. You guys tell me how many ways to beat Barrier or Shifter there are. I'd be surprised if you come up with over 10, let alone like 3 viable ones. Like Call By and Crossout are like the extent. Those don't feel good. If your deck has weaknesses to cards, you have to put cards in for Crossout just to stay alive. That's not great, but
it's not poggers,
something, I guess. The thing is here, shutting off an entire avenue of play in a turn is only big if Konami designs decks that only take one avenue of play, but it happens to be the case very often. You know, I guess could be a whole other design point Konami may have to look at in the future, but I think it'd be a lot easier just to remove these cards that are overbearingly restrictive from the game in general. Dimensional Barrier is obviously one of the worst offenders in this case, because being a trap card is probably the least interactable out of all of them, as well as shutting off an entire summoning type and effect for the whole turn, means that entire archetypes crumble, especially when some of the restrictions Konami's been giving to decks is locking them into their extra deck summoning method for the turn, which, like, I get you want to stop them from being these crazy combo decks, but then why does a card like this exist that now gives silver bullets to every single deck to counter yours? And not just like silver bullets that now you have to prepare for, silver bullets you can't do anything about. Cards like Dimensional Barrier are so bad that it is the reason I almost never play a deck that is weak to Dimensional Barrier.
For every like 5 dog shit floodgates or situationally good lingering floodgates, you know, like you previously mentioned Drone Lockbird or Shifter, there is always like the 1 or 2 that are just so needlessly oppressive that just shut down your deck in almost its entirety that you just almost can't do anything. Dimensional Barrier and to an extent Artifact Lancia are like some of those examples of just cards that if you draw them, you almost guarantee win on the spot. It's fucking so crazy. It's so crazy how needlessly oppressive these cards are. It's insane. Like, there's literally nothing your opponent could do. Like, if you're against Tenpai, 3 out of 5 times, if you flip D-Barrier on them, you almost win on the spot. Like, sometimes if you, like, brick, like, obviously, like, if you brick and the Tenpai player opens, like, you know, 4 engine cards that are able to still go, like, the Doolittle OTK line, then, like, sure, whatever. Like, most of the time, these cards are literally auto-win cards because, spoiler alerts, they are auto-win cards.
But Dimensional Barrier isn't alone. Another big one that I really hate, and I guess it's a little more interactable, is Abyss Dweller, a card I've ranted about nonstop.
Oh
and this
God,
one appeals more to me because thankfully it's people don't always play it that much, and 2 level 4 monsters being required for summon makes it not as generic as something like Dimensional Barrier. But as someone who enjoys combo decks and graveyard based decks, staring down this is a pain in the ass because you still can't interact with it that easily. You could only interact with it with quick play spells. So you were limited to, I guess now Metal Tronus, but before Forbidden Chalice and Forbidden Droplet. And then maybe there's some counterplay mind games with Infinite Impermanence versus Kaiju where you could try get them with those, although neither were foolproof plans and usually weren't worth the spot playing because they weren't foolproof. And given that you just had so few options, there was still a decent chance that the Dweller would resolve against you. And if your deck needed graveyard effects, which is a lot of decks, you just couldn't do anything.
If you guys remember 2020 Spiral format, one of the better decks in my opinion was Salamangreat. And that's because, holy shit, that deck could make Dweller. Do you know how many decks that in that format just lost to Dweller or just couldn't beat Dweller most of the time? I think almost every relevant deck. Dinosaur couldn't beat Dweller. Invoke Shaddoll had a really hard time getting past Dweller outside of a single Macabre. Spiral fucking wanted to shoot themselves every time they saw a Dweller. Like, Lunalight couldn't do anything. It was so fucked. Like, Dweller is one of those cards that 100% should have been banned like years and years and years ago.
There's the finals where I got Dwellered 4 times in a row. It sucks, man. It sucks.
There's like nothing you can do.
And now Tyr was powerful enough that there were other ways to play outside of the grave, which sounds crazy as a tier player, but it was true. I would rather play without a graveyard in Two Elements than Unchained. My biggest fear playing Unchained after the release of Rescue Ace was now there was a viable deck that could Abyss Dweller me. And now I felt like, despite my deck seemingly have a good matchup in most regards, if I went second and they knew to Dweller me, I was just boned. And that was a big turnoff for the end half of 2023 for me. I felt the Rescue Ace Unchained matchup was pretty favorable to Unchained if it wasn't Dwellered. But the second Dweller is put into equation, it feels 50-50. But the thing to note here is, on the topic of Dweller, people have stopped talking about it. You know, go back to tier format, and this card was on people's radar as a card that could potentially get banned because its overbearing presence on that format was very noticeable. And while in specifically tier format, it's arguable that it kept it in check and it was actually healthy for the game, in most cases, that's not going to be the case. Tier was the exception because it was so ridiculously powerful that it could bypass the overbearing effects that you couldn't use your graveyard, despite graveyard being the main aspect of Two Elements. And I think a card like this existing will just keep popping up from format to format, being something that is very much a problem. We've seen Dweller pop up time and time again as something that is not fun to play against. If you were Salad versus Orcust, this was like a defining card in the matchup in 2019 that was really not easy to deal with, and you had limited ability to play around. that it begs the question, why does this card need to exist? There could be something better than that. I'd rather there was graveyard removal, rather. Cards like Melodious Schuberta are really cool. They can be crippling to graveyard decks, but if your opponent is able to layer their plays effectively, they could maneuver around something like Schuberta or like DD Crow or Bestials. But Dweller is just blanket, you have nowhere to go. You can't attack over it first and then play main phase 2. You can't try and force it out and then play afterwards. You really just need to draw in your opening 6 the answer to it. And the problem here is that these exist for several different functions in Yu-Gi-Oh! And they all need to go. Artifact Lancia is another example of a lingering floodgate that says you cannot banish for the turn. And like Shifter, it's almost no counterplay. You need Call by the Grave. And that's almost it in terms of how you can stop it. And though we don't see right now a big banish deck, imagine if every single card in your deck as a cost required you to banish like the top card of your deck face down. Would that deck just be unplayable? Or would that deck automatically just have like a 33% loss factor anytime this card was being played against
shout out to Runic.
an opponent's deck? It's almost like the Ash Branded Fusion thing, except more real because you have no counterplay. Now, Konami could design decks that don't have weaknesses to the lingering floodgates that exist, but that's almost impossible considering there's lingering floodgates for almost every aspect. Even Link Summoning now has Simul Archifiends, which is pretty specific in what it does, so it hasn't been a problem yet. It's not very future-proof. There's cards that stop Graveyard, like Dimension Shifter, Different Dimension Ground, Silent Graveyard. There's cards that stop Extra Deck, like Dimensional Barrier as well. There's cards that stop all effects, period, like Calamity, all summoning, period, like Gimmick Puppet. Cards that stop searching, like Droll and Mistaken Arrest. There's cards that stop banishing, like Artifact Lancia. There's just so many. It's likely it took the effect of Threatening Roar and said, okay, sure, Battle Phase isn't too important in Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's make Threatening Roar good and make it stop everything else. And that's what all these other cards are. And I just don't see the reasoning why it should persist. And while we have cards on the ban list that clearly have lingering floodgate effects, Konami has also kind of been going in the opposite direction with his last ban list. So 8 cards currently are banned in the TCG with lingering floodgate effects. I already talked about Artifact Scythe and Maxi being some, because those are still legal in Master Duel. Same with Red Reboot. Cold Wave is another one that is banned. Utopic Zexal, which couldn't interact with. Azathoth, one of the dumbest one ever, is because it just happened. That one didn't even activate.
Azathoth is one of the fucking most silly, ridiculous cards ever printed. If you guys weren't around for Azathoth format, holy fuck, it was the most absurd shit of all time. Like, not only was it protection on your own turn, but also it was just a floodgate for your opponent's turn. What the fuck were you supposed to do? There was literally nothing you could do about it. It was insane.
Vader just said, haha, you lose. True king of all calamities. Who doesn't love the card that says you can't play the game? And Shockmaster, another card that is just awesome.
Let me get a shout out to the fact that there was almost nothing you could do to beat like Virtual World if you were playing like a monster deck. If you were playing like a monster deck back then, you like lost on the spot if you did not open a combination of Droplet and Imperm. Because guess what? If you try and Imperm them, they Chuche pop their own VFD. Only thing you could do was you had to Droplet, discard a monster and a trap card, which was almost always Imperm, or like Tri-Brigade Revolt or something. It was so fucked. Just play Abyss Actor against VFD and just steal it. You see, that's your problem. You have to play Abyss Actor.
Then, one card was banned and just came back. And that is Arch Nemesis Protos.
Yippee!
And while I'm ranting about Dweller needing to get banned and all that, this card is kind of what launched me off into this tangent, because now this has come off the list.
But
if you're not familiar with Protos, let me give you a quick rundown. You summon it by banishing 3 monsters with different attributes from your grave and interface of fields. It cannot be destroyed by card effects. And then once per turn, you can declare a monster attribute in the field to destroy all monsters on the field with that attribute. And then here's the kicker. Also, until the end of the next turn, so not even this turn, the next turn, neither player can special summon monsters with that attribute. Once it resolves, you're boned. If your deck is limited to one attribute, which is like so many decks. So how is Konami supposed to plan around building an archetype that's limited to a single attribute, right? Like, that's not going to happen for every single attribute. So every single deck that's mono attribute now will have a weakness to this card in the future, as long as it's still unbanned. Now you may say, okay, it's at 1. Why is this a problem? Well, it's searchable. You can search it with Nemesis Flag, meaning Flag is searchable via Bonfire versus Sprint and then Promethean Princess getting it back, which is not too hard. You can get it off of Banshee getting a Flag. You can also do a Sword Soul Chi-Shao, which gets Sword Soul Emergence, which gets Protos. Point being, when you want to get this card, it is fairly easy to do so. And while it might not see play at the very moment, with Yu-Gi-Oh! And as a deck builder, you always want to be very forward-thinking, thinking into the potential of the future. And as someone who's not a huge fan of handshake formats, I'm looking to a future of the game where I can return to playing high engine counts and relying on the cards in my archetype to be problem solving and to play through fields. Most decks won't have an in-house ability to beat Lingering Floodgates, so if I'm getting Protos, it kind of tells me like maybe the way that I love playing Yu-Gi-Oh just will always be invalidated.
Jesse is 100% correct, but like I can also still disagree with him. Like Protos is a card where it's so situationally good. There are very, very little applications where Protos is an active like game winner because most decks play more than one archetype, and if you want to Protos call something outside of just dark, you kind of have to set up for it in that way. You have to like get a fire onto your board, you have to get a water or something. Protos isn't as clear cut of a just auto win card as it may seem. It's not like you could just declare like, I'm going to declare Divine Beast and you can't sphere mode me anymore. Protos is not a very future-proof card as well, because it is a card where if there is ever a way where there is a good combo deck that is able to play multiple attributes or modulate their attributes in some way, no, I'm not talking about fucking Element Saber, or there is like a way to very easily splash Protos into literally anything outside of, you know, needing to commit like a bunch of engine space to play like basically the equivalent of like 5 Garnets in the Princess line, the flag stuff, and blah, 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 then Protos becomes, you know, this sort of gimmicky, weird card into just being the most oppressively annoying dog shit imaginable. Because all of a sudden, Protos is just gonna lock you out of your entire deck strategy, or like 80% of it, and you're just like caught there with your dick in your hand. We are in a fire format where flag is extremely searchable, but Protos still isn't seeing play. But that doesn't mean that, you know, new cards in the future aren't gonna come out to make Protos plays better, you know what I mean?
Protos won't always exist in the game and won't always be a viable option, which is like some help, but there's just so many Lingering Floodgates that it's kind of concerning that while these omni gates need to get banned, so do these. And now, one of the fun things about Protos here is we can talk about how the monster versions of the Lingering Floodgates are maybe a little more manageable because there are more interaction points with them. Protos is used on the prior turn. So unlike something like King Calamity or the Albion Sanctifier and the Puppet Nightmare play, which you can interact with on the turn it's happening, or Dweller even, you have to Veiler or Imperm Protos essentially, because once your turn comes, it's already in effect. You can't have Forbidden Chalice or Droplet now. And that's just crazy. Like, that's level of Shockmaster. A card that's been banned for almost a decade at this point, right? And for good reason. Because, like, if by that logic, Protos is okay to exist, Shockmaster, which is similar in requiring a bit of setup to make, but albeit makeable, and albeit somewhat interactable, that should be legal too. And please, don't get this as me advocating for Shockmaster. Like, even if these aren't the biggest problems in each format, there will be formats where these cards always pop up, because they maybe are too specific in what they do. But when they do pop up, they're never a good thing. They're almost always for the detriment of the health of the game.
Yeah, that's like literally what I said. And another great example of cards that are like, you know, have extremely narrow application as well as just having way too powerful of an effect is something like Appointer of the Red Lotus and Trap Dust Shoot. For the most part, these cards are extremely specific and for the most part not very good. If there is ever a point where a card like Appointer of the Red Lotus or Light Force Sword or Trap Dust Shoot is able to see consistent play because deck building takes a certain direction where, let's say, people are playing a lot more like board breakers or kaijus or sphere modes or stuff like that, all of a sudden cards like Trap Dust Shoot and Appointer become way better because of the ability to just completely shut down your opponent's answers, as well as be, for the most part, relatively uninteractable, which is extremely frustrating.
And I think Yu-Gi-Oh would be a lot better if what is ultimately the worst part of Yu-Gi-Oh in my opinion would just be erased. And I know this would mean a rather large banning for some of these cards like Silent Graveyard, which haven't really been too playable because there are just better alternatives. I think that is still the right course of action. So let me know what you guys think. If there's a part of Yu-Gi-Oh that you guys really hate, I'm curious to see as well, because my fixation on combo decks is a large reason why this specifically is the biggest element of Yu-Gi-Oh I dislike. So I'm wondering if you have a different playstyle, if there's a different part of Yu-Gi-Oh that you also really don't want to see. And also let me know if any of the points I made you didn't agree with, or if I missed anything on top of those. If there are any other lingering floodgates that have really caused you a problem and I just glanced over them or mentioned them at all, then share your sob stories with me. I will be the shoulder for you to cry on.
For the most part, I think that getting rid of floodgates is objectively like a healthy move. I don't think anyone is trying to deny and be like, oh, like we need floodgates. Floodgates are healthy for the game. No, floodgates are very, very silly. They almost require no real thought into activating them or using them. But I can understand why Jesse kind of has this specific stance, and it's because, as you said, he's a combo player. And I think that you're free to believe in whatever you want Yu-Gi-Oh to be. I think that just as a card game as a whole should focus on entirely one type of strategy, being like combo. I think that a blend of strategies is something that should exist. I think that for the most part, in regards to decks that exist within Yu-Gi-Oh, although Yu-Gi-Oh very much is built upon the precedent of combo good, other decks bad, and Yu-Gi-Oh very much tries to force combo down your throats, I think that for the most part, floodgates and some sort of hard control and hard counter to combo decks isn't inherently a bad thing. Now again, I'm not saying that floodgates are bad. Like again, there are a bunch of floodgates that hit control decks as well as combo decks. Like just fucking, have you read Red Reboot? That shit's fucked. It's very easy to be playing what's perceived the quote unquote best deck and then immediately get shut down by a card specifically designed to beat your deck. And for people to sort of take up arms and be like, oh, I lost to X floodgate at some regional and now I want Simul Archfiends banned forever. While I do think that floodgates are extremely oppressive, I do think that for the most part, most floodgates are relatively tame or should exist for the purpose of countering these decks. Now, do I and Cotton and every other player on planet Earth have different barometers for what too strong and too weak is? Yes, objectively, we're different people. But that's what I'm gonna leave the comment section to figure out. I wanna know what your guys' thoughts on what floodgates are too strong, what are too weak, what should be the barometer in for what constitutes too powerful versus acceptable within the game. And yeah, that's gonna be it for me, and I'll see you guys in the next video.